publications such as The Walrus, Maclean's, Canadian Business, The Globe and Mail's Report on Business, Chatelaine, Georgia Strait, Equinox, Aerosmith, and is a regular contributor to the independent newspaper The Tyee. He's also the author of 5 critically acclaimed books, which he will talk about tonight. His most recent is The Energy Slaves. And furthermore, he has written public policy documents pertaining to water and environmental issues and has participated in many initiatives to engage and educate Albertans about the political, economic, social, and environmental issues that are critical in our province, our nation, and abroad.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming out on a Friday evening. And I promise you a very interesting and intriguing talk. Thank God he says. First, I want to acknowledge the students here who have been working on fracking and the very important and significant work they have done in organizing a conference here last November and inviting citizens from across the province, as well as tracking the development of this extremely important controversy. And I just want to acknowledge that, look, Leah and Jordy and Kate and Raj, you are making a difference, and you are showing others how to make a difference in your community. So congratulations, first of all. Now, some of the issues I want to talk about tonight are a bit weighty. I'm going to talk a bit about fracking and how fracking is very much a symptom of some pretty deep energy problems that we are beginning to encounter. And then I'm going to give you, we're going to go through a romp through history about how our attitudes towards energy have changed, and I'm going to talk about our servitude to fossil fuels and what that means. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty politics of what happens to a petrostate when it becomes hooked on oil and gas revenues. That I am talking about tomorrow at the Rural Symposium that the New Democrats have put on, and that I believe will be at the United Church. It's from 9 to 5. And I promise you that, and one of the reasons I didn't want to distract from that event by talking about petropolitics here tonight too much. So anyway, before we delve into this, I was recently in Manitoba, and I had to speak to a group of economists. And so I thought, well, how do I wake these guys up? So I came across this story about a shepherd. And of course, being in this country, Camrose, we're used to have greater sheep populations. But he was out in his field, and sure enough, a guy walks up to him. And as the stranger approaches, you know, the shepherd's wondering, who the hell is this individual walking out in the fields like this? And then the man boldly walks up to him and he says, I've got one of your sheep that I can tell you how many animals you have in your flock. And the shepherd was thinking, I've got a large flock, there's no way he's going to get the correct number. He said, okay, I'll take your bet. You're on. Immediately the man came up with a number. 757 sheep. Jeepers, said the shepherd. You're bang on, that's it. All right, I'm a man of my word. Take your animal. Which the man promptly did. And then, as he was about to leave, the shepherd said, now wait a moment. Give me an opportunity to earn that animal back. If I can guess your profession, can I have my animal back? The man said, that sounds fair to me. All right, so what do you think I do? Okay. And the shepherd said, I think you're an economist from a government think tank. And the man's his jaw dropped. He said, how did you know? He said, put down my dog and I'll tell you. good jokes are always subversive jokes. So, let's begin. This is a stunning image. This is, maybe we can lower the lights a little bit so we can, but this is an image that tells us much about how we use energy. And here we can see Calgary, here we can see Edmonton, and here we can see Fort McMurray. Here's another NASA photograph. Here we can see Sioux Falls and Minneapolis and Bismarck, North Dakota, and this 200 wide kilometer city is the Bakken oil fields. And what you're seeing are the flares and the lights from the drilling rigs for that play. Now both photographs give you a real sense of the energy intensity of these new unconventional hydrocarbons that we are exploiting. And there's a real problem with this energy intensity, not to mention its capital intensity, not to mention the carbon emissions coming off these grand, spectacular projects of unbelievable scale. So let's just talk a little bit about fracking. We know that there's been a shale gale, a huge revolution that was supposed to change North American life, and that we would be tapping into an endless flow of natural gas from shale rocks deep in the ground. Now, shale is the most common rock on the planet. It's a bit like concrete. It's dense, it's thick, and you basically have to blow it apart with brute force to release methane. Now, the interesting thing, though, here's a shale formation in the Marcellus Play. This is in New York. Look at all of the natural fracks in this shale formation. So what's going to end, which really also release small amounts of methane, and what's going to happen when you start to blast apart more fractures? They are going, man-made ones, they're going to communicate with these natural fluids. And then eventually you are going to find more and more methane, which is a light gas, and it wants to go up, not go down, in your groundwater, in your surface water, and in your atmosphere. Industry said, no worries. This is a great affordable alternative. This will create an industrial renaissance in the United States. There's 100 years of supply of this gas. And this is the bridge to our new energy future. And we have fellows like Andrew Nikiforuk, the president, the late president of Chesapeake Energy, who is been removed and is now under investigation by the SEC Securities Commission in the United States for fraud, embezzlement, and a few other issues. He said, you know, don't worry, this is all going to work out just fine. This is great technology. He said, we can tear up a road, we can be noisy, we can create dust, we can hurt somebody, and sometimes there's a lack of transparency about our operations. All those are legitimate concerns, but fracking is not the story. Well, all of those concerns are part of the story, and fracking is very much a central character, despite what Mr. McClendon would say. And so we had this massive gas rush, where you had companies like Chesapeake essentially leased enough land, about 11 million hectares, or the equivalent of the size of West Virginia, on their own. That's just Chesapeake's ownings. Encana leased another area the same size. And in fact, in the state of Michigan, they are now under investigation for cooperating together to drive down land prices so that they could scoop up potential shale gas leases. So anyway, you had this massive rush for shale, funded by Wall Street with easy credit. And then you had, these massive experiments where you had huge frac jobs. 16-well operation, 417 million gallons of water being used, 400 tons of sand, 78,000 tons of sand, unbelievable. 8 million gallons of fracking chemicals, including diesel fuel and a few other things. So 500 frac intervals, 10,000 foot laterals. What's the horsepower you need to power this operation? 40,000. Amazing. Extraordinary events. And then you have an impact on the landscape like this. Here's your produced water. There's all your vehicles and stuff that you need for the various fracking stuff. Here's the greater impact you leave on the landscape with the well pads. This is in the Jonah Field in Colorado and Wyoming, tight gas play. And so you have industry planning, okay, we do a mile by square mile. This is, we'll put a pad here, and then with our drilling down and then drilling horizontally a mile or two, we will try to capture all the gas in that area. And this is a map of what shale gas development would look like just south of Calgary. Here's the window. Had all this activity. Everyone jumped in here and said, okay, let's frack the hell out of this rock. And what did they do? They crashed the price of natural gas. And this is important, okay? So it costs about $6 NCF to do a frac job. Industry is now getting just barely more than $2 per NCF. So this has now become almost an uneconomic activity unless government lowers royalties, lowers taxes. It has become a subsidized activity in many parts of North America. Chesapeake has had to sell off billions of dollars of assets. Encana, another big player, has had to sell off billions of dollars of assets. It's interesting that the CEOs of both of these companies have had to resign in the last 2 months because of concerns about their competence and the future of their companies. And of course, there have been more than just issues about road traffic and noise. We have the problem with methane coming up from well bores. We know now that when you take a well bore and you drill vertically and then horizontally, which in industry term is known as a deviated well, you're going to have much greater incidence of methane leakage. We know, and here's industry saying, well, this red bar represents the thickness of a shale play. These lines indicate where the fracks have gone. That controlling a frac job is not easy. It's non-linear chaos. And that these man-made fracks can then join and connect to natural fracks in the rock leading to groundwater. So the fracks don't always stay in shale. That's a slide from Tony and Graphia. So here you've got a frac job. There's your formation. 1,800 feet away, your frac has gone. 1,500 feet away, your frac has gone. Here's an example. In Alberta, this is an illustration from the Energy Resources Conservation Board from a presentation they made in Europe that they thought that no sensible Albertan could ever get a hold of, showing the consequence of a frac job and methane leakage in rural Alberta, coming right up out of the ground. And here's the same presentation. This is from Teresa Watson, by the way, who now sits on the board of the ERCB. You would think that somebody who knows all of this might actually speak up on behalf of landowners, but she hasn't. But here's your making her prediction. Okay, so we've got a lot of water wells in central Alberta where there's a tremendous amount of fracking going on, and at the same, so something's going to have to give here, and she's suggesting it will be the water. An increase in the number of water wells increases the likelihood that gas, due to migration through shallow zones, can accumulate in buildings. Here's just a video of the methane emission from a frac job. You can actually record it. Some fields now industry always said, oh, we might have a 2% leakage rate in a field. What scientists are now finding is a 9% leakage. That makes shale gas a more onerous activity than the burning of coal in terms of its contribution to climate change. And why is that? Well, we'll come back in a moment, but because methane is a pretty potent greenhouse gas. So that's one end. You've got one end of the industry leaking like hell, 90% in the field, and then you take this natural gas to a city, and here in Boston, they recently did some infrared camera work, and they found a 5% leakage rate in the transmission lines in the city, and some leaks in some areas were so great that the methane were killing trees on the streets of Boston. First time this has ever been done, that somebody, a scientist actually, had the gumption and the material and the cameras to go around and check where all the leaks are, and actually record it. Here's another illustration. You can see the parts per million of methane coming off different parts of the gas transmission line in Boston, Massachusetts. So, why is methane such an issue? 33 times more potent than CO2 over 100 years, 105 times more potent over 20 years. Even a small leakage rate is important. So each 1% lifetime production leakage from a well produces about the same climate impact as burning the methane twice. So if you wanted to find a way to warm up the climate faster, the shale gas industry would be one way to do it. And then, of course, we have the promises, oh, we've got enough shale gas here to last us for 100 years. Wrong. The depletion rate of these wells after a year or two production is nearly 50%. And fields that they predicted would last 40 years will last probably no more than 4 or 5. So this is not a bridge to the future. So everything that industry said about this resource, and the business press, I might add, as well as a whole bunch of governments interested in some income from this resource, turned out to be false. Rapid depletion, poor recovery rates of less than 10%, chronic methane leakage into the atmosphere and into groundwater. And as Arthur Berman, who's a great geologist in Houston, Texas, puts it, this is not a bridge to the future. Shale gas is a retirement party for the industry. Deborah Rogers, who's a former investment banker, also from Texas, puts it this way in a great report she just wrote. She's got a fantastic blog called Energy Policy Forum. Every region in the U.S. which has shale development provides a cautionary tale. Economic stability has proved elusive. Environmental degradation and peripheral costs, however, have proved very real indeed. All right. So let's take the story now a little bit further. There we have one illustration of our fanatical devotion to fossil fuels, that we will sacrifice groundwater, rural communities, government revenue, you name it, in pursuit of a resource, madly. So oil has been called by some people the master resource. I would include all fossil fuels in there. It's an apt term. But 80% of all transportation fuels are fossil fuels. And here's the energy pie in the globe, all right? So oil accounts for 37% of all the energy we use, right across the globe. Coal is still 25%. Gas is 23%, right? The shale gale was supposed to take gas and grow it to around 30%. That was the prediction. That's not going to happen. Nuclear, 6%. Biomass, that's trees and crop fuels, that's 4%. Hydropower is 3%. And the renewables, what we want to ramp up as quickly as possible are 1% or less. What this simple pie chart tells you is that it took us 150 years to get gas and coal and oil here. How long will it take us to get renewables into similar percentages? I would suggest a long time. given the fact that we haven't even started. So we've got a bit of a problem there. And we have this infrastructure on the ground, and the guys that own this infrastructure are going to make sure that there's nothing to compete against it. This is the business as usual crowd, and just take a look at that. That's $1 trillion worth of infrastructure built over 100 years, owned by approximately 10 to 20 companies at this point in time, and they're not going to give it up to windmills or solar or geothermal or without a fight. Some of the world's biggest companies are oil companies. Here's Sinopec. This is a company that has major interests in the oil sands as well as in the Northern Gateway, proposed Northern Gateway pipeline. This company controls almost all of the refining in China and Asia. A monster company. It's bigger than ExxonMobil, which is also a monster company, which is also a state within the state of the United States, where it used to be Standard Oil. This company was the primary funder of the Republican Party in the last U.S. presidential election. Incredibly powerful company. This is a company, too, that funded most of the climate change denial propaganda for the last 15 years. So oil, just oil alone, and we're not including natural gas, is a $3 to $5 trillion industry a year. It is the largest commodity by volume traded on the planet, and the most lucrative, and also the most volatile. And the volatility is increasing. Look at this, primary volatility events, one after another, as perhaps we've approached this point, global peak oil, which means not the end of oil, it just means the end of affordable oil. And oil sands production, the Bakken play, are all signatures of peak oil. We wouldn't be developing resources that extreme if we weren't running out of the good stuff, the light stuff, the cheap stuff. And so what we will see over time, and all of us here will experience this, is increased volatility in prices for oil. So we'll see more and more oil shocks. And if we live in a petrostate such as Alberta, we will also live through more political volatility as well. Because we've not prepared, the province is not prepared for this kind of volatility at all. The province thinks we're still living back in this era. Now, this is not the first time we've dealt with a resource that was so dominant, so important, so significant in energy terms. So let's go back. And let's go back to ancient civilizations. All right, those guys didn't have oil, they didn't have gas. They had the trees, they would burn trees for fuel and stuff. But what was their primary source of energy? It was people. It was shackled muscle. It was slaves. That's how you ran Egypt. That's how you ran Rome. That's how you ran Babylonia. It all ran on shackled human muscle. The Greeks, the same. Now, what did they say about these slaves? They had the ancients had an incredible way to refer to slaves who were doing work for them, right? And or providing comforts, but basically their job was to do work. They called them speaking tools. I kid you not. The ancients actually had a much better understanding of energy than we do today. Anyway, so they saw them as speaking tools. If you were a slave, you were socially dead. You basically had no life. If you got into really heavy debt in ancient times, their only way to get out of it basically was to sell yourself as a slave and become a slave. And then you experience this whole position of community death. Slaves were used primarily for agricultural work. They were used in the irrigation. They were used in the plantations in Sicily, southern Rome, you name it. But then there were household slaves. There were slaves for everything. There were doctors who were slaves. There were sexual slaves. There were musical slaves. There were slaves that provided entertainment. The dwarfs and the hunchbacks were known as the entertainment slaves. And no society exploited this resource quite as completely as the Romans. So here's one Roman talking about this whole system. Oh, by the way, and I'll come back to it. We use other people's feet when we go out. We use other people's eyes to recognize things. We use another person's memory to greet people. We use someone else's help to stay alive. The only things we keep for ourselves are our pleasures. Pliny the Elder. And the Romans even had a slave called a nomenclator. And the nomenclator's job was to accompany his master down the streets of Rome. And if the master met somebody whose name he could not remember, that's job of the slave was to remember his name and say, well, this is Mr. Romeo, by the way. So, right, and that's Mrs. Romeo. And that slave, that speaking tool was performing one job and that of an iPod or a GPS unit. Oh, and by the way, there's a great spaghetti house around the corner. Right. And Rome didn't have oil and gas companies, but it did have an army, and the army's job was to go forth and conquer and send home energy. Caesar would go off to Gaul, and he would capture as many as 70,000 prisoners, and he would send them back to Rome to work in the Roman economy, into Roman households and Roman farms. Incredible trade. The Roman army kept on growing and growing, as it got harder and harder to acquire slaves, either in North Africa or Spain, or it became a hellish job in Scotland. The Scots just had to build a wall to keep the Scots from getting into too much trouble. And so you can see here a story of diminishing returns over time. And then the empire began to fall apart as it ran out of cheap sources of energy that it could conquer and send back to Rome, with all kinds of financial consequences for the empire. In my book, Energy of Slaves, what I essentially suggest is that many of our attitudes about energy directly come from our first experience of slavery as an energy institution. In other words, this abusive institution has shaped the way we use energy today. Okay, well, let's explore this a little bit. All right, so Rome falls apart. We have about 1,000 years known as the Dark Ages. And then, 16th, 17th century, Europe is running out of trees. They've all been chopped down to help smelter iron and to make glass. And finally someone said, maybe we should be using these stinky rocks called coal. And they start mining like mad. The aristocracy of Europe really doesn't think coal is a dirty fuel and smelly, and no, we shouldn't be using it. Eventually they get converted. And so then our experience with fossil fuels begins. And we run into problems immediately because the mines are getting so deep, they're filling with water, and it's getting increasingly hard to mine the coal. So a brilliant Scottish inventor by the name of James Watt comes up with the steam engine. And what's the purpose of the steam engine? And what you're looking at is an energy slave that can do work. And what kind of work does it do? It pumps water out of coal mines. And that's the first job of the steam engine. And soon we see that this new energy slave is being employed for other industries in other different ways. And by 1824, England's steam engines puffed about 26,000 horsepower, the equivalent of nearly 750,000 men, nearly 1 million men, or 100,000 horses. So now we've found a cheap source of energy that can power a machine that does muscle work for us. And we go crazy about it. We think, this is amazing. The whole British Empire was built on its ability to fuel steam engines that added to the British Empire 3 billion inanimate slaves to their economy. And that's what the British Empire was about, fundamentally. Access the cheap energy, the fuel. It's a new energy machines, new energy slaves. So now let's bring the story up a little bit more. So that was our first hydrocarbon that we got very fond of. Next comes oil. Right? This is Pennsylvania, 1850s. This is now, the same Pennsylvania that is now the scene of the Marcellus shale gas boom. That has resulted in the same sort of frenzied development we see here in the 1860s and 1870s, which was the equivalent of, the California gold rush, but this was in Pennsylvania. And we see, this is California, Huntington Beach, in the 1920s. And so we see one oil boom after another across the United States. It starts in Pennsylvania, goes on a little bit to Illinois, and Texas explodes around 1900s. There's also Oklahoma, California, and these states become, for all intents and purposes, the world's major supplier of oil for nearly 40 or 50 years. They are the first Middle East. All right? California is kind of like Kuwait, and Texas becomes, Saudi Arabia, America's. And the Americans get hooked on oil. Here's John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, the guy that figured out that there was more money to be made in refining oil than in drilling it. And he said about this energy source, man, this is going to reorganize business. It makes it easier to concentrate business. It makes it easier to standardize things. And with all that power and money, you can destroy your competition. And Rockefeller, of course, was a great believer in secrecy, of not telling people what kind of contracts and secret deals he had made with other people in the business. All right, oil is forced use as a source of illumination. It's used as for lamps. But then we figure out, hey, you can put oil in a combustion engine, they were first invented around 1880. Most of them running on vegetable oils, actually. And then you can get an energy slave like this, whose 40% of the first names were all automobiles, essentially derived, again, from our experience with slavery. They were called patrician, power mastering. People knew what they were buying. They were buying a machine that could comfortably carry them around from one place to another at incredible speeds. And they knew what this was about. So America goes on a joyride with the automobile. This infatuation with combustion engines and with steam engines, all powered by hydrocarbons, though, presents a huge problem for American society. It changes American society in so many different ways. It was a society that was supposed to be about being community-minded and resilient and independent, self-reliant, and that all gets blown out of the water with oil and this multiplication of energy slaves. In 1860, men were self-employed. By 1910, the majority of men were working with machines. And what were they doing with machines? I mean, they were managing them or monitoring them, or they were actually slaves to these machines, doing repetitive tasks. And the Oleans, who are they're a husband and wife couple in Texas, who are very famous oil historians, make this brilliant observation that this change in energy flow in American society created a calamity for masculinity, which I would say is still here and very much alive today. And I would also make the argument it also powerfully changed other gender roles too. Along comes this guy, Buckminster Fuller, the guy, the geodesic dome guy, your ultimate nerdy professor. And he makes this powerful observation. He says, look, 1810, here's the United States. You have 1 million families and 1 million slaves, on average, but we know that most of the slaves were all in the southern part of the United States. And he says, okay, well, that's where kind of the United States began, and then where did it go? By the 1940s, with hydrocarbons being fed to energy machines, combustion engines largely, each and every American had the equivalent of 39 energy slaves at their fingertips. And the rest of the world is kind of wondering, well, why are these Americans so cocky? why are they so different? Why are they, had a lot to do with the power they had at their command. And they knew it. They were the world's richest country in terms of energy. So Buckminster Fuller put it all together. In a business magazine, no less, in 1940. He says, and he even accompanied it with this great little map showing where all the people are on the planet. There were about 2 billion folks then, and where all their energy slaves were. And they were in the number of 36 billion inanimate energy slaves. And he made all these estimates based on energy data provided by the US military and the British military, right? So he comes up with these amazing figures. And he says, look, mechanization, the harnessing of energy, is man's answer to slavery. But he gets it right. He gets this right that there's been a tremendous change in how we go about doing things. So what's in a barrel of oil? All right, 6 billion joules. All right, and like most people, you're probably scratching your head saying, what the hell is a joule? Well, if I were to stick you on a treadmill and have you running hard out for an hour, you would be producing 360,000 joules an hour. Okay? So let's do the math. Then a barrel of oil is really equivalent to having a guy doing work for you on a treadmill, more or less, for 3.8 years. Right? So let's do some more math. And where does that get us then? Well, the average North American consumes 24 barrels. That equals 89 slaves per person. A North American family of 5 commands 500 inanimate slaves. A nation of 300 million controls 26 billion energy slaves. So you now have a sense of a different way of looking at the world. This explains to you why the British Empire was as powerful as it was. It had coal and it had steam engines. And this also explains why the American Empire was the next one to come to fore. They had oil, they had combustion engines, and they had more inanimate slaves than the British Empire could ever dream of. Here's another way to look at it. Here's 1 gallon of gasoline. How much work when 1 gallon of gasoline do? 1 gallon equals 360 to 490 hours of strenuous work valued at $6,500. So next time you fill up at a gas station, think about that. We think gasoline is cheap. We haven't valued it properly at all, not according to the kind of work we can do, which is why we don't value it at all, really. And the geological services required to make a gallon of gasoline in terms of, going back now 200 million years, the photosynthesis, don't forget, this is buried sunshine of one kind or another, the geological pressure to compress all of those plants, the cooking that is taking place to make this oil. Each gallon of gasoline is really worth $1 million in terms of geological services. And this was a calculation that Buckminster Fuller's had done by one of the preeminent geologists of his day, a guy from New Mexico. And I'm trying to remember his name. He wrote all kinds of scientific papers. And that was his valuation. And, ultimately what Buckminster Fuller concluded in the 1960s alone was that the average American was burning through his car $300 million worth of buried treasure in the ground without knowing it. So what do we use this incredible resource, very versatile, very unprecedented energy resource for? Well, to make more energy slaves. And you can find this, the message here in all of these advertisements, right? One man can farm more land with, the universal tractor. And the emphasis is always you can do more. And do more or make more. But you can do more because you've got this inanimate muscle at your command. Here you never even have to lift. So the emphasis is always on doing work for you, or making you more comfortable, or entertaining you, the same functions as slaves in Roman society. Have done increased earning power. Chainsaw. The one-man saw that does the work of other two-man saws, And of course, our digital slaves. I mean, they're not just mechanical slaves, they're not just combustion engines, they're not just electrical slaves, they're digital slaves. And what so many people forget is they think, oh, this is part of some kind of new economy, new way of doing things. Nope. It takes 12 kilograms of fuel to make 1 kilogram of computer. The whole digital revolution was a product of cheap energy. Period. Here's another example. These microchips, the amount of energy needed to make these microchips alone to power your digital slaves is greater than the amount of energy you will ever use in a laptop or in your cell phone over its lifetime. So the energy embedded in the making of these gadgets is much greater than the energy you will spend using, which makes the whole recycling game a little bit ridiculous in some ways. And we are multiplying these digital slaves. So there are two industrial revolutions. The first one was mechanizing muscle. The second industrial revolution was about mechanizing mental activities with digital machines. Here, I'm just going to take the embodied energy of the memory chip alone already exceeds the energy consumption of a laptop during its life expectancy of 3 years. That's a good thing. I mean, these slaves are only, they're only supposed to last 3 years and then be obsolete. 83% of a computer's total energy use is dominated by its production. And incredible proliferation of this stuff. So here's another calculation. This is from a gal in California who figured out if you add energy slaves powered by oil, by electricity, by natural gas, by nuclear power, then we really have 147 energy slaves working for us every day, 24/7. And then it gets even more complicated because then we have people working with these energy slaves here. This is a garment factory in China. So we've got slaves working with energy slaves. The Industrial Revolution all over again. And you can even go to websites that can tell you that when you go buy cheap stuff from around the world, they'll tell you how many real slaves are tethered to machines to produce that running shoe, those jeans, that hat, that fancy coat, that digital slavery equipment that you've got. So that's slaveryfootprint.org. So what have we used all of these slaves for? Well, I mean, in ancient times, slavery was personal, in your face, abusive, and the goal was you would serve your master, and sometimes your master might be an understanding sort of fellow, but in most cases, I mean, the cruelties and abuse were unbelievable. And so here we have a different relationship with our energy slaves now, but we have not taken away the abuse. But now the abuse is on a planetary scale, on a global scale, in terms of we are enslaving ecosystems. We are abusing the oceans. This is an amazing graphic because, okay, the white lines, that's air pathways. The red, that's cities. The green are roads. The blue are the shipping networks. So these are all of our energy slaves at work, changing and reconfiguring the entire planet. And we're talking about tens of billions of energy slaves at our command doing stuff for us. And we've forgotten about what their impact might be on the broader world, not to mention ourselves, our own spiritual selves, our families, our communities. What happens to a person when they have 89 energy slaves at their command? How does that change your family dynamics? How does that change your community? How does that change your relationship with your own children? You know, a lot of slave owners in both Rome and even in some of the United States were very concerned about the impact of slavery on their children. Said, well, you're going to get fat and lazy, and you're going to become incompetent, and you're not going to want to do anything. and you won't want to work with your hands, because that's associated with something bad, with slavery. So we've used our energy slaves to increase the number of people on the planet by providing all kinds of comforts and foods for them, and medicines. We have increased our energy expenditures per person 10 times since the 1850s, and we are now consuming 70 times more energy than we did in 1850. We all know that none of this is sustainable. All right, so here's energy slaves at work with deforestation. Energy slaves in the sea. Imagine having a net that you could put 13 jumbo jets in. We all know about the whole story about fisheries depletion and the overcapacity, that we have more boats out there that can capture more fish than ever before, with the result that we have to go deeper and further out into the oceans, and we're getting, we're going after the smaller stuff. In fact, in some cases, all we're going after are sea cucumbers at the bottom of the ocean, and we're running out. Very much a product of our use of energy slaves, and the fact that we don't want to regulate them or control them. So what happens when you have, across the world, millions of 5 horsepower diesel engines to pump groundwater? Look at the rates of depletion in North Africa, in India, in China, throughout the Middle East. That wouldn't have been possible, again, without cheap energy and the energy slaves to do different kinds of work. Here's a frac job. This one is probably close to, I don't know, probably 30,000 horsepower. Here's a super tanker. This is 100,000 horsepower. This is running on bunker oil. And this one ship alone creates the same amount of air pollution as 50 million cars. And then we wonder what happens when you have a bunch of diesel engines in a room running 24/7 for nearly 150 years now. And we can't figure out why the room is getting so warm and volatile and turbulent and unpredictable. But that's exactly what climate change is all about. And we think, oh, but there's only 7 billion of us on the planet. No, there isn't. There's 7 billion people, plus there's tens of billions of energy slaves at our beck and command. And then we look at how this relationship has influenced our corporations, our corporate structure, and we find all of these big corporations, right? And look at them. These are the world's top 13 corporations. This is from Forbes magazine. Walmart. Walmart controls 40% of all the food retail business now in the United States. Royal Dutch Shell, ExxonMobil, BP, Sinopec, China National Petroleum, the State Grid, that's a Chinese electricity company, Toyota Motor, Japan Post Holdings, Chevron, Total, ConocoPhillips. The majority are oil or massive oil spenders. You can almost see a monoculture taking effect. All right, so we have tremendous impact on population. Until we got hooked on hydrocarbons, our numbers never got above 1 billion. We were kind of kept in our place. We had to use our own energies, and we couldn't run on buried sunshine in the ground. When we started to do that, here's the first oil well, which corresponds, by the way, very closely to the end of slavery, or technically with the end of certain forms of slavery. And then fossil fuels become the Viagra of the species. And off we go. And now, that era has ended, and we are now experiencing expensive oil, difficult oil, at the same time that we have reached this peak of 7 billion people. And at the same time that folks in China and India want to live the same way we live in North America. Here's Colin Campbell, who worked in the oil and gas industry for 40 years, and illustrating peak oil, which is something every university student is well aware of. Come every Friday or Saturday night when you experience real depletion with a beer bottle. The problem is that this pub will be closed forever. So oil and our use of fossil fuels has changed everything, every aspect of our lives, and it's not something we think much about. So when we were low energy societies, we had cities that were no more than 2 miles across. They were walkable, right? And they were intimately connected to the countryside, and they were highly organic places. But how that all changes when we start designing our cities not for people anymore, but to accommodate all of our energy slaves, particularly vehicles, cars, and trucks. And then we see this massive push of everything up into the sky. And cities themselves have grown in such dramatic scale that, you know, we've got cities of 30 million people and more. And we keep on growing them. And we keep on saying, well, isn't this great? I mean, we just got to make these cities bigger and bigger and bigger. And, you know, and a lot of people who have lived off the land for generations look at this and say, man, this is bullshit. This is not going to fly. This is not going to work in the long run. This is a huge sequestering and spending of energy all in one place. And what happens? Depletion of groundwater, loss of farmland, air pollution, heat sinks. We now know that the presence of cities in certain parts of the globe affect the climate hundreds of miles away from where they are located. And yet we continue to spend our energy to build more and more of what I call human feedlots. Tremendous impact, again, of oil and cheap energy on agriculture, which was at one time very much a culture that was based on the use of communal work and human muscle and sunshine. And it was a cultural resource that didn't always respect limits, but certainly tried to, and was developing in many creative directions. The largest movement against the use of machines on farms, of course, were among farmers. They said, look, I can't, if I replace my horses with this thing, where am I going to get my manure from? Right? And you know what? I like my horse. My horse is intelligent. And but if I get rid of my horse and my other livestock and stuff, then I've lost my manure. I then become dependent on fertilizers, and I'm no longer that self-reliant, independent individual I wanted to be.
By the way, why did it drop after 19?
Saturation of the marketplace. And plus the fact that there were no farmers left to buy tractors. You know, we removed 70, yeah, I mean, they were so bigger tractors. So what mechanization drove 70% of the population of North America off farms and into cities, right? So incredible social movement of social engineering. Here's Norman Borlaug, the Green Revolution, where he actually figured out a way to change the energy flow in grain plants, so that the heads would be fuller and the stalks would be shorter. And he did that with John D. Rockefeller's important observation about oil for concentrate. The Green Revolution is failing. It's failing all around the world. In India's Punjab, they've depleted their groundwater. They can no longer afford the fertilizers. They're having difficulty affording hydrocarbons to keep their energy slaves running. They have the highest rate of suicide in the Punjab and other parts of India, just among farmers today. Oil and cheap energy has changed our economic thinking, and our economic thinking at one time was very much about real stuff. It was about people and landscape and livestock and sunshine and climate and weather and how this whole intricate system worked over time. It was about real stuff. The plutocrats in France had talked about this. And then with cheap energy, it all suddenly becomes into something else. Economics is no longer a moral philosophy. It's all about the science of wealth. Here's Irving Fisher. He was a famous American economist in the 1920s who famously predicted that, you know, the boom in Wall Street, and this was in October of 1929, he said could never end. He actually lost his entire fortune, and the tradition of making inaccurate predictions continues to this day among economists. But Fisher thought of the economy as this way. He thought of it as a machine, and you could pull little levers, and if you pull the right lever, you get a rich man, and pull the wrong lever, you get a poor man. What Fisher did not see in any part of the economy was energy. And so one product of having cheap energy was that you took it out of all economic thinking. A disastrous thing to do. But then we get this one way of thinking about the world, economic monoculture. Self-interested individuals will buy cheap stuff, made possible by cheap energy, and there will be no limits to how big the world of markets can be. This is F.F. Michaels, who's a gal in British Columbia, who's written a brilliant book, very short, just called Monoculture. That's all about how our story in North America is just this one story. It's about money. How do you get the money? It's not about family, it's not about community, it's not about faith. It's individuals are only on this planet to make money. That is a new story for the planet. That is not how civilization thought or worked prior to the advent of cheap energy. Frederick Soddy, brilliant British scientist, had this to say. He said, no, wait a moment, you economists are all crazy. He said this in the 1920s and 1930s. He said, you've got it all wrong. If the supply of energy fails, modern civilization would come to an end as abruptly as the music of an organ deprived of wind. Your economic models are useless, stupid, incompetent, and negligent, aren't going to hurt ordinary people. And he said, wealth is a flow, and it cannot be saved. The world is now divided into those countries that export oil and those companies that import oil. And if you are exporting oil, your bank accounts might be growing, except not in Canada and Alberta. But and if you are importing oil, you are experiencing massive deficits, like Europe, like Japan, like the United States. And petrostates, these states that sit on these hydrocarbons, are very peculiar. I'll be talking about this tomorrow. And those are some of their character traits. And here's what Terry Lynn Curl, American political scientist, has to say. When taxation is absent, in other words, if petrostates are running on oil money, they don't run on taxes. Populations tend to be politically inactive, relatively obedient, and surprisingly loyal. They become subjects. They are no longer citizens because they aren't being taxed. If you're not being taxed, you're not going to be represented. The United States is now in a bit of trouble. It was a petrostate in the 1970s. Its oil production peaked, became reliant on oil from the Middle East. This is a little blip from the Bakken play, which I don't think will be anywhere near as significant as the illustration is showing. American politics are completely polarized and divided between the red and blue states. But really, the red states are the states that are producing hydrocarbons, and the blue states are the states that are importing hydrocarbons. Here are the hydrocarbon deposits in the United States. So, where are we going, right? We've now seen the end of cheap energy, basically, particularly oil. Here you can see oil production, global oil production has plateaued. And I don't think it's going to be able to grow much more because the costs of energy inputs are becoming too great. This project in our backyard is a signature of deep oil. When you have to dig, when you have to cut down a forest, roll up the soil, and then dig an area the size of Rhode Island, which we will do by around 2030, to keep things going, this project is telling you that business as usual has ended. This is one of the world's most expensive hydrocarbons, one of its most carbon intensive, and one of its most energy intensive. We are now using 20% of Canada's natural gas supply to enrich bitumen with hydrogen so that we can create something called synthetic oil. Here's another extreme behavior. You know, when you're drilling 2 miles underground and then horizontally another 2 miles into rock as thick as concrete and blasting it apart with phenomenal amounts of horsepower and millions of gallons of water and chemicals and sand to get rapidly depleting amounts of methane and challenging your groundwater and atmospheric emissions at the same time, that's desperation. When you have to go to the Gulf of Mexico and drill 2 miles underneath the ocean floor, again, extreme costs, huge amounts of energy, it is also a signal of desperation. And here's the best way to measure this. All right, so there's this concept, energy return on energy invested. Every animal on the planet understands this concept. When you see a grizzly bear in a salmon stream in the fall, where the bear barely has to move to haul in some calories, that's a guy who's figured out where great energy returns are. I have a friend who's a science writer, Ed Struzik in Edmonton, and he was telling me the other day he's working on a book on polar bears. A polar bear is also acutely aware of energy returns and energy invested, and they will not hunt. What they will do is that they will lie on the ice, on an ice floe, and they'll wait for that seal to pop his stupid head through the hole. And as soon as he does, they've got him. Polar bear will not be off swimming for hours trying to catch that seal. The other remarkable thing about polar bears, when they're going through a colony of geese, and there might be 100,000 geese there, and people have witnessed this, the bears will not kill one bird. And why? Because the bear knows that if it expends more than 12 seconds of energy trying to kill a bird, it will have spent more energy than it will get back in terms of calories. So they will walk through a nesting colony of geese, and they will not eat one bird because the energy returns are not there. Remarkable, right? We've forgotten all about this. Cheap energy has allowed us to forget all. Right? So, returns with oil, originally, 1 barrel would get you 100 more. Incredible surplus. So the counts why oil became such a valuable commodity. Now, globally, around the world, it takes 1 barrel of energy, or oil equivalent, to get 20 more. What about the tar sands? Tar sands are a totally different barrel of fish. There we're using 1 barrel of oil or oil equivalent, much of it being natural gas, to get 5 barrels more. And so here's a neat little graph of energy return on energy invested over time. You can see some sources. This is, by the way, Follett and Trevor. This is from England's one of its largest stock brokerages. So you get pretty high returns with oil and gas, hydroelectricity, some coal. Here we get our return levels for oil and gas in the 70s. Here are the returns for wind power. Here are current oil and gas finds. Here's nuclear, photovoltaic solar. Here's the tar sands. Here's shale gas. Here are biofuels, which have about a 1-on-1 return. So the problem is, we built the civilization on this stuff, and we're moving this direction, and how are we going to survive on returns this minimal? No discussion about it in the press or anywhere else. So this is what our economy used to look like, where, somewhere between 4 to 6% of our household budgets would be spent on energy. And this is the new economy, where we are getting fewer returns and having to spend more and more on energy production and extraction. And the shale gas revolution is a perfect illustration of this story of diminishing returns. And so the world that the experts predict, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and better and better, it might actually look like this as it contracts and diminishes and slows down. Joseph Tager in New Mexico, great anthropologist, puts it this way: what do we use cheap energy for? And what do we use all these inanimate energy slaves for? Well, we've used them to create ever higher levels of complexity. They create all sorts of problems that we try to solve by employing more energy and more energy slaves. And his argument is, at a certain point, you're going to reach a level in this spiral where you will not have the energy to support the complexity that you have created. And because that's the relationship we have with oil, because of the connection of energy to problem solving, we will not stop using fossil fuels until we are forced to. And I think Joseph Taylor's probably right. The Romans did not end slavery. It never occurred to the ancients that abolition was even worthy of political discussion. Fred Cotterill, American sociologist, what is he here in the 50s? He's talking about what's going to happen. We've seen the energy ascent in the United States. What will the energy descent be like? The growth of centralized government will stop and wither. Moreover, the energy descent will unleash endemic conflict. Those whose greatest advantage is in the marketplace will struggle to protect it. I think that's pretty prophetic. So here we have this era of fossil fuels has created this empire of energy slaves that has basically tried to master every aspect of planetary life and place it in a position of servitude to one species on the planet. That's us. The good news is that we don't need all this energy to be happy, to live great lives. Velakat Schnil has noted that 7 barrels or equivalent of oil is all you basically need to enjoy an incredibly satisfying life. In fact, one of the things that North Americans are always struck by is that when they go to low energy societies and low carbon societies in Latin America or in Africa, they're always surprised at how happy people are, how community minded they are, how strong their family bonds are, because they're not contending with all these energy slaves, which put stresses on all of those aspects of human life. So Schmill says, look, we don't need to do this high energy spending thing. We've gone off on a tangent here, a great joyride, but you know what? And this guy, he's absolutely brilliant. But the energy industry always likes to emphasize one part of his message and not the other part. This is the part of the message they'll never talk about. Anyway, he's at the University of Manitoba. He says, high energy spending does not guarantee prosperity, does not deliver quality, does not ensure security, does not enrich culture, does not promote stability, does not increase diversity. Some of the most undemocratic nations on the planet are the highest energy spenders. So this does not guarantee. High energy spending does not guarantee anything except greater environmental burdens. So one of our great fights as a species is trying to figure out how much energy do we really need and how do we use it and where do we employ it. We obviously want some comfort. We want some machines to do some heavy lifting for us, but we haven't found the right perspective or the right scale or the right fuels for those machines. So Nike, believe it or not, we're going to sell shoes with shackles on them. And a whole bunch of folks in the United States were just outraged. They said, this is bullshit. What are you doing? And so they had to take them off the market. But we're wearing those shackles nonetheless. We all have to go on an energy diet. Much easier said than done. And no one can really predict where this is all going to go. Right? Anyone that tells you they can tell you what the future is going to be like and how we're going to solve all these problems And, there's been some great research on experts, and it's basically shown that they're wrong almost all the time. 80 to 90% of the time, they are wrong. And in fact, you could have a group of chimpanzees answer all of your questions, and they would be much more accurate than these experts in terms of prediction. In fact, I compared it, if I had the chimpanzees throwing darts at a board, it would be better. So, we have created big institutions, big government, big corporations, big markets. Well, small replace big. Leopold Kohr puts it this way: if a society grows beyond its optimum size, its problems must eventually outrun the growth of those human faculties which are necessary for dealing with them. Hence, it is always bigness and only bigness, which is the problem of existence. The problem is not to grow, but to stop growing. The answer is not unity, but division. So what do we see with the European Union? One of these big unions break up the same way the former Soviet Union did. Will we replace our rampant materialism, which is reminiscent of Rome, with a new spiritualism? This is Saint Benedict, son of Roman slaveholders, who walked away from Rome and started a monastic community built where everyone was equal and where everyone used their hands and where everyone worked for 5 hours a day, and then they spent the rest of their day in prayer, in fellowship, in making beautiful things. We have spent our energy to go faster and faster and faster. Maybe it's time to slow down and actually to enjoy life, to enjoy each other's company, to stop rushing. We have used our high energy spending to become highly individualistic. Maybe it's time for us to start thinking like communities again. This is a great poster from World War II. We've used our high energy to waste stuff. 50% of all the food we now make with all of these fertilizers and machines and pesticides and all this oil ends up in the garbage. Extraordinary. 50%. Use it up, wear it out, make it do. We can use a bit of that. We've used all this high energy to produce a lot of cheap shit. We haven't used it for this. And when you go back and you look at low energy societies and the quality of their craftsmanship, of their buildings, of the richness of their arts, and you are stunned by the fact that high energy spending does not deliver quality of any kind. We are totally disengaged. Right? We're not paying attention to where we are, what we're doing, who we are with. This guy, he's in an energy slave. He's got one in his ear, for God's sake. Another one is telling him, where to go before he runs over a couple of kids on the road. And then we've used high amounts of energy to grow like fires. Wendell Berry once put it, what we really must learn how to do is to grow our communities and our economies like trees, not like fires. I'll end with Ivan Illich, great Catholic theologian. Inequity, hairedness, and impotence appear everywhere once voracious hordes of energy slaves outnumber people by a certain proportion. The energy crisis focuses concern on the scarcity of fodder for these slaves. I prefer to ask whether freedmen need them. And that is not a conversation you're going to hear very often. Thank you.
We're going to have a few questions, and we have another about 15 minutes. Who's the second? Oh, okay, we've got it first. Okay.
I heard Stephen Lewis, and I've taken a course from Smill. I really enjoyed that years ago. But Stephen Lewis said he tends to buy into the idea that there will be an apocalypse somewhere between 2040 and 2050. I assume he means peak oil, climate change, refugees, things like that. Can you say more?
I don't know too much about Stephen Lewis's thinking. His timelines, I think, are a little bit long. I think we will begin to experience a series of emergencies within the next 10 years. That will be related to the volatility in energy prices combined with a volatile climate. That will be hammering away at coastlines, hammering away at food supplies, and we will have difficulty keeping on top of it all. And I wouldn't call this an end of the world event, but it will result in a fair amount of suffering for many ordinary people around the world. And we're not prepared for it, and our governments are not prepared for it. And so it will be really up to the preparedness of individual communities and families, as all these things always have been, right? You can never count on government when you need it. And there are many communities around the world that are preparing. It's called the transition movement, where you plant gardens in your community, where you plant trees, where you start raising chickens, where you start making sure that the folks of the old folks' home near you have a garden that they can depend on for some of their products. Very powerful movement. And it's not about despair. It's not about any of that stuff. It's about what can I do positively now in my community. And what's astounding about it, and I went to a meeting at Winnipeg recently, one of my sons lives there. So I went to a transition movement. 50% of the people in the room, and it was about a crowd as big as this, were all small businessmen in Winnipeg. And they were looking for opportunities. They said, okay, I wouldn't mind starting a cooperative bakery in this old community, because we're going to need one. You know? Or I wouldn't mind starting we need a green grocery here. They're all gone. And I'd love to do, you know, they're, anyway, extraordinary.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether you have more exact figures than I've heard so far. Exactly how economic the tar sands is, especially
Martin, you can have your louder.
especially the SAG-D kinds of productions. Because I'm beginning to wonder whether, as a matter of fact, it's the inability of us to get the price on our tar sand in Alberta to get this price that it needs on the tar sands product isn't really reflecting the fact that it's just become uneconomic to process it.
Okay, so the question is about bitumen, and the question is how economic is bitumen production right now? All right, if you're a mining operation and you have a great, I mean, there are sweet spots in Fort McMurray, in the Athabasca deposit, where, you know, your formation might be 14% bitumen. Okay? And so the mining operations need a return of, the older mining operations are making very healthy profits when oil is $80 a barrel. And if they're producing stuff at 25 or less. Okay. The in situ operations and the newer mines need much higher returns. They're not really profitable until you've got $80, $90 a barrel. So the older portions of the tar sands are highly profitable. The newer stuff that has come on stream is highly dependent on having high sustained oil. All right, now you asked about, okay, well, why is bitumen getting such a shitty price south of the border? Well, that's the product of overproduction and flooding the marketplace. We approved more than 100 projects since 1998, and we had no plan for adding value to this resource here at home. Although that's not true, because at one point we thought we might be building 10 upgraders outside of Edmonton, 2006, 2007, right? And then that all changed. And then it was a mad rush to export raw bitumen as quickly as we possibly could. We flooded the U.S. Midwest market. We brought the price of bitumen down. And at the same time, we have a financial crisis and shock. The brilliant minds in Edmonton, of course, had thought that nothing like this could ever happen, and nor did they foresee the fact that U.S. oil consumption has been dropping since 2008 by nearly 1 million barrels a year for a whole bunch of reasons. The middle class in the United States is disappearing. People are driving less, traveling less. Or as one oil and gas guy came up to me and said, Andrew, the reason Americans are using less oil is because they're texting too much. And I said, okay, well, that might be part of it too. And I had to laugh. I thought, okay, well, I hadn't heard that one before, but I'm sure it's played a role in decreasing oil consumption. And then along comes the Bakken play, which the government should have predicted because they'd already been hammered by hydraulic fracking and the shale gas revolution, which, by the way, after 2008, when natural gas prices dropped, remember I showed you that graph? The province lost $6 billion in revenue. We've been a natural gas kingdom for nearly 20 years, not an oil kingdom. And our royalties for bitumen are so low that they will never replace what we were earning from natural gas. So, really we have a variety of problems. Is that number one, we've produced the resource too quickly. The reason we have so many people out there trying to overproduce themselves is because we have cheap royalties. All right, so we are not earning proper returns on the resource for the owners of the resource. We are giving it away still. We have no plan about how to add value to the resource, which is where all the jobs and all the money would eventually flow from. No public strategy whatsoever. We still want to dump it into refineries owned by the Saudis and the Venezuelans and the Koch brothers in the Gulf Coast of Mexico and call that prosperity for Alberta. That's bullshit. You know? So I'll be talking more about this subject tomorrow, about some of the huge strategic mistakes we have made. You know, Lougheed had it right. He put together a very simple plan. He said, you know, behave like an owner, collect your fair share, which we have not done. Save for a rainy day, which we have not done. Add value to the resource. Clean up the mess. And then he also added a sixth one. Go slow. He was appalled at the pace and scale of development that has gone on there. So.
What do you think, given what you just said, what do you think the chances are that the XL, that the Gateway,
Keystone
or the
XL.
Keystone XL and the Gateway are going to go through or not? Like all we're hearing from Redford every second day is we've got to get that pipeline, we've got to get more product. So it's exactly exacerbating what you've just described in terms of the situation.
Yeah, it's exactly, what is it, would be a great analogy would be grain farmers in the panhandle of Texas in the 1920s saying the solution to low grain prices would be to plow up more prairie to produce more grain with the hope that the prices might go up. Every petrostate thinks there's only one solution to problems of bad governments, poor planning, lousy royalties, and they think that solution is building another pipeline. All right, so what do I think is going to happen with these pipelines? I think the United States will say no to Keystone XL. But then I think that decision will be irrelevant because there are other connections that other companies are building to take some of the glut of bitumen out of the U.S. Midwest to coastal refineries. So one way or another, it might not find its way to the Gulf Coast in the same volume, but it will find its way to the Gulf Coast. The Northern Gateway will not be built. It will not be built unless you want to pave the way with dead Indians. It simply is an impossible project. The public resistance to that project in British Columbia is unbelievable. And that project would have ramped up production in the tar sands threefold. And it is a big mistake for us at this point in time to ramp up this project, given how volatile oil is. You know, and I argued back in 2008, we should cap production at 2 million barrels a day and solve some of these other problems. And now, the only solution we see to our financial problems, our royalty problems, our spending problems, our saving problems, is more benefit. And that to me is a catastrophic course to take. It's like the Titanic has left the dog. The engineer is an alcoholic. Not only that, he doesn't even believe in icebergs.
You said a bit at the end through Transition Town, some directions to take, but can you say a bit more of how, whether it's on a local, individual, or whatever level one works against the servitude, extreme servitude to the energy slaves?
Well, these are all moral and philosophical questions, right? And the whole purpose of the Energy Slaves book was to invite people to start asking these questions. Because we think that energy is only about money, and when it really profoundly is really about asking who we are as a people, and what we want to achieve, and how does the use of so many energy slaves affect human energy in our lives, right? And even at a profound level, how does it change love, which, you know, Leo Tolstoy used to think was the greatest human energy there is, right? And in my conclusion is basically, we can live with a lot less, and not only that, we'll be a lot happier for it. We will not be moving as fast. We will have stronger communities. We will have stronger families. We'll be working more with our hands, but we'll be much happier people. Now, how do you pursue that, and how do you do that? And I think, you know, there will be no government program, there'll be no corporate program. This is not, you know, this will be very much, and here you can see my own, I guess, beliefs here, that it will be very much people making a decision to walk away from this bullshit. Saying, okay, I got it. You know, I'm going to take care of my family and the people I love, and I'm going to disconnect and unplug. And I'm going to start doing things different. And I'll get rid of my car, I'm going to walk more, I'm going to have my garden, I'm going to try to make my house as off the grid as I possibly can, you know, but this is what St. Benedict did. He said, look, you know, this stuff in Rome is crazy. I'm walking away. He walked away, and he set up another community. A community that was not dependent on the cheap energy source of its day, which was human slavery. He said, you know what? We can live comfortably and well if we work together. And if we use these. And if we treat all members of this community equally. And so, you had rich Romans, and you had former slaves, and you had all kinds of folks in these communities working together. And in some ways, the transition movement, which was started in England, is very much part of this. It's about making kind of a decision, well, should I spend all my energies to prevent some real trouble that I know is coming down the pipe, or should I just prepare for a more comfortable transition for the people I love, or for the communities I care for? And so these are all individual choices that we have to make. And my concern as a journalist, and I would say, like, my idea of what journalism is all about, which is kind of an alien idea these days, but there's a great Israeli journalist by the name of Amira Haas, and her definition of journalism was to monitor power. So my job as a journalist is to monitor that power and to let you know when it's becoming incredibly abusive and has lost its concern for ordinary people and their welfare. And so I think, you know, there are many, many different paths that people can take to do things differently and to consume less energy. I mean, start limiting the number of digital slaves you bring into your household. Start turning some of this stuff off and getting rid of it. And, any number of things you can do.
On that note, Horace.
I just have one
Last
question.
please.
You kind of shut down the pipelines to both directions, but the Chinese have a pretty large investment in the tar sands. Are they just going to sit on their money, or are they going to go that other proposal, which is to join up with the Alaska pipeline that's there already?
I'm not quite sure where the Chinese are going to go. They would certainly not blanch at the prospect of a pipeline on top of dead Indians all the way to Fort Kitimat. That wouldn't bother them much. It certainly hasn't stopped them in Tibet, hasn't stopped them in other parts of China. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure if all their investments that are in the tar sands have they invested there to learn how to do this back in China, because they have bitumen deposits there as well, or have they invested here as part of, I mean, they do have a global strategy about energy, and they are cornering markets all over the globe, and they're also recognizing that some of these investments will not work, will not play out. The Chinese are very strategic, unlike Canadians. And they have a government that has basically said, well, has promised them, I think, that the pipeline will be approved. Well, and the show will begin. It'll be a political battle that Canada will never forget, I can tell you that. So, I mean, the Chinese are our players in all this, right? You're absolutely right. I think they'd be quite happy if some of this bitumen got to the Gulf Coast. They just want to see it go global. But they'd love it if Canadians would build them a pipeline and ship them a raw resource like bitumen that they then could add all the value to in their own refineries in China. They would love that. What a sweetheart deal for them. Not only that the Northern Gateway pipeline makes us dependent on foreign oil, because it's a two-way pipeline. One pipeline is bringing in 500,000 barrels of light oil to mix with that bitumen, so you can put it through the export pipeline. So that makes the country dependent on foreign oil. Kind of self-defeating when, we should have been upgrading this stuff ourselves. But then there's the other issue of, can you build these pipelines and still meet any climate change obligations? Every scientist I've talked to has said, no way. You cannot expand this project. It's a dead end. Doesn't mean people aren't going to stop. I mean, obviously there's a whole bunch of people out there who don't consider climate change a threat to their business plans.
So I want to thank Andrew, and I'll also mention that Andrew has a few more books left, not many, right?
There's a few.
There's still a few left, so if you want to buy, I think, Energy Slaves and
The
Tar
Empire
Sands.
of the Beetle.
Okay, and the beetle book on the pine beetle. Those are available. Rodson is holding them up. Andrew acknowledged the students who have been organizing events, particularly around fracking, starting actually last spring, and then put on the conference, and then this is one of the follow-up events. But the sponsor for these events is the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life, and so it's very lovely that this actually ends with St. Benedict. In other words, rediscovering community and rediscovering our connection to land, people, and ultimately a respect for land and water and air, which has to fuel it, and revaluing the human body not only as something that you bring, to the computer and you use your brain and a few fingers, but actually a body that is used for our work together in building community and creating the transitions that we each can start doing. So thank you very much for that. And one little notice just to switch from the Chester Ronning Center. The water issue is crucial, and a local NGO called Sahakarini is showing a series of films on water. The next one happens to be on March the 6th over here in the classroom building. You go straight in. We'll have Galen Hader from U of A Edmonton, come and talk about the ethics of water use, and we'll be showing a very haunting film called White Water, Black Gold, which traces a drop of water from the headwaters of the Athabasca all the way down past Fort McMurray, Fort Mackay, etc. And so we seriously have to start thinking about water, and that has us right back into, it doesn't discuss fracking, but it ties right back into the discussion of fracking that we've been having today. What happens to the water? And if we take the water out of the hydrological cycle forever, and it will leak up in toxic ways into our waterways, whether it's immediately in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, what are we doing? You know, what care and respect do we have actually for the water for life, which all of us need? What are we, about 85%, 90% water or something? So we're, you know, a very high quantity of us, each person is water dependent. And I think my grandchildren are equally water dependent, although some of them are still milk dependent, but that is, but anyhow, so I think it's a very, very crucial topic, and so it's lovely that Andrew, both this morning and now, has given us a broader frame for starting to think about these issues. So thanks again for coming.
I would just like to thank Dietmar again for his hospitality and Augustana University for, it's always a great pleasure to come to this university. This is my second or third time I've come here to give talks. You do things very differently here, and you are a very friendly place, and you are extremely community-minded, and you are really an example of how other universities, unnamed ones, should behave these days. So, thank you.
Yes,
Yeah.